Hi, my name is Craig Rice. Good evening. Thank you for joining us on We the People Recommended Watching. It's a series of conversations inspired by a selection of films. I want to thank you for joining us. There's a Q&A button. If you have questions, please type them in, and we'll get to those in sort of the order and based on the topics that we're at this time. The Film Society is a nonprofit organization that dedicated to independent international cinema. I want to thank you for joining. If you're a member, thank you for supporting the program. Also, if you're not a member, please join us at mspfilm.org. For more information, you can also go to mspfilm.org for additional information on the organization. I want to thank the people who helped us put this together. I want to thank Penny and Bill George Foundation, Kelly and Mike Palmer, and Knock Communications for their help and their support in putting this together. Tonight, we're going to be discussing a film, Jim Crow of the North, and I want to thank TPT for supporting this project. And I want to direct us to an award-winning director, Daniel Pierce Bergin, which I didn't know your middle name till now, Dan, which is good. It's a producer director of this film. Also want to introduce some of the other people that are on the panel. Kevin Solberg, who is a co-founder of the Mapping Prejudice Project for the University of Minnesota. He has worked with Dan on the making of this film. I also want to thank Anthony Scott, who is president of Minnesota Black Community Project, and Dr. Chaunda Scott, who is also part of the Minnesota Black Community Project, but she's also a doctor. She teaches associate professor of graduate coordinator of diversity and inclusion specialist at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. So I want to thank you for joining us. And Brian Paulson, who's program officer of the Pohlad Foundation on Housing and Racial Justice section, also getting involved in rebuilding or rediscovery, I'm sorry, how you say this, reestablishing the buildings and properties that were just destroyed in the uprising recently. So he's got a lot of work set up for himself. I want to thank you all for coming. One of the things about this film that really struck me when I first seen it was, it goes back to a thing that a lot of people don't know how true this was, but there's the 40 acres and a mule, which was given to slaves it was a promise of land, which land has a value. And it was a situation where people obviously knew that there was a certain amount of theft that was taken away from Black people during that period of time. The collective Black wealth of America today is about 2% of the entire gross of General Motors. There is an issue that we need to get property, we need to get houses, we need to get land. Part of the process in this film that Dan created, and I wanted to talk to Dan about this at first to say, Dan, what was it about this film that stimulated you into making this film?
Yeah, thanks, Craig, and thanks everyone for joining us, and I'm glad to be a part of this awesome panel. What a great introduction, the power of wealth and land. That was one of the reasons why we thought this was an important story to tell, was in a way, the origin story to the worst in the nation disparities that African Americans and other people of color struggle under in Minnesota. So I was aware and friends and past collaborators with the Mapping Prejudice team, and was aware of their research. And so we thought it would be, in part because of the data-based narrative, documentary films can kind of take a lot of different forms in terms of the kind of storytelling. But one of the things that was really compelling to me about this was the kind of irrefutable data that the Mapping Prejudice team was surfacing about restrictive covenants, laying the groundwork for red lines, which created a lot of the disparities that we see today in so many ways. So knew that that would be a powerful touchstone to talk about the struggles of today, is to look into the past. And as someone who produces history documentaries, I always think there's a power in knowing the past. But we also wanted to bring in, and Anthony and Dr. Scott can talk more about this too, we wanted to bring in some of the assets, the strengths, the resilience, the resistance too, that comes alongside this kind of oppressive history. And so I would have loved to have done more of that, but wanted to make sure that our voices were there in resistance.
Yeah, I wanted to open it up to others just to get their thoughts about the film in general before we get into more specifics. So, if you, Dr. Scott, if you want to jump in here, or Anthony, just your ideas. Go ahead.
I'll jump in. Thank you for the invite. It's wonderful to be a part of this discussion. I looked at the film a couple times, and I thought it was very well done. You know, it was really good to see that, you know, the University of Minnesota was shining the light on this issue and, you know, bringing it to the awareness of, you know, people past and present, you know, who were here when that was happening and people who were unaware that that happened. So I thought that was very clearly laid out. I really liked the view of the homes of the Jackson family and the Simpsons families where they lived. I thought it was just a great expression of showing what research can do. And so I was hoping that, you know, moving on in the discussion that it'll be more work done on that, because when you're bringing it to the forefront, then I think the next question that needs to be asked is this still happening in Minnesota? And if so, what can be done about it? So I thought it was a great first step to bring awareness to this, but you know, I would really like to see more done on the issue of racism, because I think it's been a pressing issue that has been under-researched and underexplored.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit. Is it still going on too in a minute here? Anthony, you want to jump in here, or?
Yeah, I do. You know, I really enjoyed watching having grown up here in the Twin Cities, you know, and coming up on 70 years old. You know, it was a real reminder as to how so many people came up here with nothing from the South and the Great Migration, and was not only in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but around the country. People were coming out of the South and coming up to northern areas, and here in particular, it kind of just segued into a lot of the things that my dad was doing, his work in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where he was really highlighting the community and showing that there was another side of the community that wasn't being written about in the papers. It was just kind of going on. And when you look at some of his books and you see things like the credit union that they had, when you see one of his books that he never really finished, but there's 15 businesses in South Minneapolis and St. Paul and North Minneapolis. And when I watched the movie, it just really brought back so many of the memories and the names of people that I grew up with, and how freeways and redlining and education and how these things really kind of dovetail along with voting laws that have all happened all along this progression as we come up. And I think the movie just really captured a real snapshot of our Twin Cities area, the Great Migration, and how people were able to, in spite of the redlining, we had servicemen that came out with VA benefits, but they couldn't buy homes. They couldn't take advantage of FHA loans, and it really pointed out to me how the government has been complicit in a lot of these things. I think it was a great film, and I just applaud Daniel for his work.
Yeah, one of the things that you know, Anthony and Dr. Son, we grew up in the same neighborhood, but the issue that I really want to get out there is your father was instrumental in sort of cataloging and collecting Black Minnesota history, specifically in the Twin Cities, and there was a series of books that every Black family had this book, and you got a new one coming out, and now you guys revived this book.
Yes, we have the new book that has just been released. We also did a virtual release. I guess this is the lay of the land these days, and it's Minnesota's Black community, the 21st century. If I could put it up, I don't know if you can see it or not. But it's based on the work that my dad started. And as part of this, as we put his book together, the Scott Collection, which is all three of his books that was released by the Historical Society, we also were networked with another great family in the Twin Cities, the Crutchfield family. Dr. Crutchfield and his family have just been instrumental in helping us get the nonprofit going and really just showing another side. And it's really so timely now, obviously, with so many things going on in our country, and it looks like whenever there's these upheavals, these things seem to be timed around certain areas in the 60s and coming up, and now in our George Floyd world, which people really are opening up their eyes to a lot of the things that have happened that have led us to this point. And hopefully we'll say from this point that we want to be better. And that's why our books really show that there's a lot of capable African Americans in the Twin Cities that have roots here that are really able to pitch in and make this city better. As as I watched, Daniel's movie, I thought too, how did the Twin Cities go down that fast? I mean, when I grew up, I don't recall all the disparities and all of us being picked out as being someone saying worse than Mississippi as far as rights and opportunities. So we're in a critical phase right now, and we hope that our work is, and along with the work you're doing and Daniel's doing, I hope this brings this up to the forefront so we can plan, put our heads together and make this better.
It's a great collection of books. It definitely is about Black population. I mean, going all the way back in the Twin Cities. Brian, what are your thoughts about the film?
I thought it was really powerful. I just really appreciated the perspective and the approach as it relates to really showing in clear detail institutional racism and the past practice that I think continues to shape the landscape today, and that racially explicit policies of the past must be reconciled and must be something that we look at as it relates to that which has shaped some of the worst disparities in our state, in the nation. So I think it was something that was powerful in watching as a white person and seeing clearly how that really has shaped poverty in our communities and some of the disproportionate poverty in certain neighborhoods, and a real clear example of both institutional and more systemic racism. And for white people, I do think it provides the opportunity to dig into where we have experienced privilege as a result. I know my parents benefited from an FHA-backed mortgage. My mom was a GI and access to the GI Bill, and that these things ultimately shape what we experience and that privilege. I think there's this opportunity that is clearly in front of us to look at that past and what can be done now, and really being racially explicit in some of the solutions as well.
Kevin, this was really, you obviously were an entity in the film. I wanted to know, what did you discover? First of all, what was it that made you want to get involved in this issue? And then what was it you discovered as you were going through this process?
Yeah. Don't want to talk for the next 2 hours. I think that'd be unfair. Yeah, it's been a long journey. When I started Mapping Prejudice with Dr. Kirsten Delegard and Penny Peterson, they're the other two original co-founders of this project, but a little over 4 years ago now, we never, I don't think any of us had any idea kind of where this was going to go. And the initial real idea behind what became Mapping Prejudice was to identify some racial covenants, probably write a journal article about it, maybe a few blog posts, and then kind of move on to the next thing. And this whole idea of, is it even possible to kind of comprehensively map and catalog like the totality of racial restrictions, racially restrictive covenants for an urban area? Because no one's ever done that before. All the work kind of up to this point has relied on sampling or kind of various ways to get around the fact that the only way to find a covenant is to read a deed, and when you have millions and millions of deeds, it just becomes this crazy scalability problem. And we were fortunate to kind of come up with some novel kind of approaches on how to slice that, and the results have been, fascinating / incredibly depressing. We all expected to find some racial covenants, but as we've kind of continued in this work and we've been able to kind of quantify like the damage done by these things and also the privilege kind of materialized by these things for the white residents of the city, it's been shocking. Some work that we've done recently with a few economists have found I think Anthony was talking about this, or maybe it was Chaunda, but kind of what's going on today, why are these disparities getting worse, right? Well, we know one thing is that through this work that we've done with these, with Raja Sood and Will Spiegel, that, covenanted homes outperform identical homes that don't have racial covenants by about 15%. Homes in areas that were redlined underperform city median by about 25%. So the difference kind of between those two polls is almost, it's like $100,000, right? And those kind of material disparities have just been steadily increasing long after racial covenants have been made illegal. And there's almost just this again, I don't know a better word than depressing, but this like depressingly powerful inertia behind this stuff that once it becomes encoded into the landscape, we almost don't need that explicit racial barrier anymore, right? Like the money is sort of doing that work for it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, it's been great kind of being involved in this project. I'm very grateful that we've been able to kind of find some, I've been able to find research that does meaningful work in the world. That's what I've always wanted to do as a geographer, and we're incredibly fortunate that we have Daniel here in the Twin Cities, one of the, in my opinion, best documentarians around. We get to hang out and produce stuff together. Well, I mean, not produce in the sense, but produce it in the sense of I can contribute something, or our project can.
Research is part of it. Research is part of documentary work. Anthony, you were going to say something?
No, I just want to springboard right onto that. All the things, when you do this work, one of the things that I found out is you're surprised about the things you find out. In the course of doing this, you find out how deep it is, and how the redlining, and how it was such a barrier, as you were saying, to wealth. I mean, it always, my dad used to say things like, well, the only way you can catch a man ahead of you in the race is to run faster. And I think that's what we really had to do from day one, because I have houses still in our family that were redlined and that were sold on a contract for deed. And we were able to somehow, as my grandfather would say, well, it took two jobs to make one good one. And so I never really saw him, because he was working as a janitor at the University of Minnesota, cutting hair on the weekends, and then doing his work around the house and in the neighborhood. So he had multiple streams of income. And a lot of his people that grew up in South Minneapolis that I knew, they were resilient. And I think some of that is really put out in Dan's movie. And I think the resiliency and the things, it just segues into a lot of the things that my dad did. Yeah. Where you see, in the course of doing his work, I found out, and I had lunch with Mr. Ron Edwards. And Ron tells me, I knew your dad, and he actually there was a group with him, my dad, Jeannie Cooper, she was a female who had the Twin City Observer, Mary Kyle, and Cecil Newman. And they actually went to the powers that be, the newspapers, and said, you're not covering us. And when we do our papers, we need to have advertisement. And they stuck together to make those things happen. So they've been a real beacon to this day. And we're still seeing the oppression and the residual effects of the redlining and all of the almost wanting to just hold people in a certain place. Yeah. And we've seen it in many cities, where you start hearing about Tulsa, you start hearing about Wilmington, you start about East St. Louis, which I had never heard about before.
Well, we grew up in South Minneapolis, and they're very actually blocks away from each other, and you heard these stories. There was specific things you knew about. You knew about the house on 46th and the Lee House on 46th. You knew about this. Is like legendary that 6,000 people basically terrorized this black family that moved just several blocks outside of the redlining area. So you heard about this. You also knew that there were certain things that you couldn't go past. You couldn't go past First Avenue. You couldn't go past Chicago Avenue. You grew up in this to a certain extent. It made you feel, as a black person, even though your father had several jobs, my father had several jobs to be able to afford the house, you realized that it basically, what it did is it took away some of the sense of progress that my parents had, and it obviously protected white people and maybe gave them value and privilege, but it was really something that it took away from us, and I think that's something that I hopefully, as I want to talk to Brian about this, in this new process that you're talking about sort of, the restructuring, and not just gentrification, but a new process where minorities or people of color can get homes that give them value and support them in their sense of being. You want to address that, Brian?
Yeah, I can touch on that. So the Pohlad Foundation about 2 or 3 years ago established a focus on housing stability with the goal of preventing and ending homelessness. And in that work, quickly came to realize that the disparities in homelessness were as deep as any of the other disparities in the Twin Cities. And as we learn more about the issue, deepen some of our understanding about things like racial covenants and how that has shaped the larger landscape. So we are really, to the point I had made earlier, really trying to be racially explicit in our grant making, particularly now as it relates to the disparities and where we can have an impact on who disproportionately experiences homelessness. And I think our board's history has been giving very directly as it relates to benefit to individual families, young people. We talk a lot at the foundation about money in pockets. Those are the things that resonate. That's very charitable. But increasingly, as we're deepening our understanding around housing stability and the factors that impact it, we are really getting into more of the structural challenges, the things that really undergird housing stability in our community and the racial disparities that we see. So really trying to look at how we impact larger systems and policies in addition to helping meet needs of today. As it relates to advancing racial justice and some of the grants and the commitment that was just announced by the Pohlads within the last 3 months following George Floyd's murder. It really is a commitment to forwarding racial justice more broadly and really looking to community to help identify what some of the solutions are and what the best options are to advance racial justice in the community. So I think that's the other piece that I would touch on is that it's not foundations that hold the solutions, that it is held in community, and community is going to help guide our priorities and some of the work that we support and look at different ways to advance racial justice, including things like in the redevelopment process and helping to restore some of the cultural corridors that we're not only trying to defend against gentrification, but that there is an actual opportunity to advance racial equity in some of the development as it moves forward.
As I know that.
Also, Craig, I was just going to say,
Yeah.
you're supporting the narrative change work as well at Pohlad, and that's so important. And I love this discussion because it's and Anthony keeps bringing us back, and of course I've got my copy of the Scott collection. But this idea of the strength and resilience that Craig and Dr. Scott and Anthony, you all represent, and your families, and I'm a Southsider born and raised as well. But then despite that, that these systemic racist policies and institutions still can create the kind of disparities, even with all that hard work is, again, chilling. And so that idea of both those narratives are right and need to be a part of the discourse, that, the strength-based storytelling, but also acknowledging the hard truths of white supremacy and racism in Minnesota is key. And this is where Kevin, used the R word in our interview. It didn't make it into the cut, but it's interesting how normalized now this idea of reparations is, and that it's part of the political discourse. But Kevin, I remember when we were filming the interviews, you were dropping it, and I was like, whoa, that I don't hear that a lot in this kind of context, but that as scholars, you all are seeing your work, and I hope our narrative, really pushing at change. I know one of the questions that has come up is about real change in addition to just awareness. And so I know that's important to everybody in this conversation.
Yeah, I know that I've been doing these for a couple of weeks. Reparation comes up quite often. I mean, and it has to stop being, because part of this is that it's got to stop being the boogeyman word. That it is obvious that there is a need for some type of repair economically for the African American community. I don't know what that is. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but there is something. You know, it's like the Prince songs. When do we get paid for the work that we've done? You know, there's something that has to be taken care of, and it's got to be, to Brian's thing, it's got to be more than just giving money in some people's pockets and then having them walk away. There's got to be a rebuilding of America. If we want this country to survive the way that we believe that it will be, then I think we need to do that. I was going to ask you just another question, since you got the reparation question, Dan, is that there other steps that we can do, and this may be Dr. Scott, if there's other things that we can do, steps that we can do, because I don't have the answers, but we do need to come up with some answers. And I think there are people who actually want to do something, as people called earlier, wanting to sort of rename some of the streets in Minneapolis based on people who were part of this redlining process. What can we do? What are some things we can do?
Well, I think like one of the things we could do, there's a lot of literature being written about Minnesota, whether it be from the New York Times or just in Minnesota itself, saying that this is the worst place for African Americans to live. We don't really see the visibility of the African Americans here that are really doing something, like the Crutchfield family. But you always see what's on the news. It's always somebody African American doing something wrong. So I think we need to share the limelight, because we don't do that. The news media would rather report about the neighbor getting the cat out the tree than what somebody successful African American person is doing in the community. So I think that's one of the real problems, is that we don't get any airtime. I'm from Minneapolis. I'm still over here on 4645 right now this summer, because I am living in Michigan. I'm on 3rd Avenue. And, there is nobody writing about me. I mean, I have a master's degree from Harvard, doctorate from Columbia, a Fulbright scholar in South Africa. I mean, nobody's saying anything about me, but let somebody do something, rob the store, then we're going to be talking about that for 5 or 6 weeks. So I think we do need to address the racial justice, but I think we need to start looking at the small things we can do right away. And what I'm saying is we need to give more airtime to what the African American community is doing. Like right now, we focus more on what the Somalian community is doing, and they just came here. And they're in the government, they're on city council. Where is the representation of the African American people here? So, I'm rather disgusted by that, because I know we are smart people. Why aren't we in the mix? And so I don't want to just be a study, having a study that said this is what happened to African Americans. I want to see more studies to see what's going to happen as a result of what happened to African Americans. What are we going to do about it? Yeah. That's what I would like to see.
Kevin, is there any kind of work that you guys are going to do at the U that's in that sort of that direction to her,
Yeah, well, yes and no. And I do want to, a community poll just popped up.
Yeah, that's all right. You should let me know. Don't worry.
It distracted me. So I was like, oh, shit, did I break something? I always preface this by kind of acknowledging the limitations of what a project like us can actually achieve, right? Like, I'm a trained geographer. Like, I can make maps, but I don't have any experience at all, like living Old South Side, or being Black in North Minneapolis, or like being a part of that community. And I also strongly believe that the solutions to centuries, right, of these structural issues should come from the folks who have been dealing with those structural issues. And that kind of our role at Mapping Prejudice in terms of like, what do we do next, or how does this go forward, is boosting the work of like BIPOC-led, African-American-led local community orgs who actually have really good ideas about kind of what those next steps are. We're in the process of forming a community advisory board so we can like better articulate that. But again, it's, who should be driving that conversation, and kind of what role should we be playing in that is something that, we think a lot about. I'm not sure if there's a perfect kind of way forward on that, but, to Dr. Scott's point in terms of kind of how narrative around Blackness is often coded in these ways, where it's like, yeah, if somebody robs a store, that's that eats up 10 news cycles, but no one's talking about Dr. Scott's accomplishments which far outweigh mine, it sounds like, in terms of academia. I certainly didn't go to Columbia, but we're not talking about that. And I think racial covenants actually kind of speak to that in some interesting ways. Where covenants are doing multiple things, right? They're doing this material thing. They're kind of encoding into the landscape, like who gets to accumulate wealth through ownership, right? Like they have a huge impact on that. But they're also really normalizing the idea that, this idea that like the quality of space is determined by the racial character of that space's occupants, right? Mm-hmm. And if you work with historical data, 19th century cities are far less segregated than 20th century cities. Like cities like Minneapolis are more segregated now than they were circa 1900 or 1910. So that's actually a comparatively recent sort of deployment of racism. This idea that like people need to live in these distinct kind of racially homogenous neighborhoods. And covenants did a lot of work for that. And that idea, though, that white space is coded as being safer, it's coded as better, coded as, all these kind of qualitative things that are ascribed to it, like that never changed, in my opinion, right? Like the mechanism of racial covenants are illegal, but the idea that white space is safe and black space is dangerous is very much still in play. And again, speaks to what Dr. Scott was talking about, where like that's the story that people are always kind of latching onto, because this like way that we've ascribed these qualitative attributes to like the race of space, this kind of racialization of spatial process, that just doesn't really seem to have changed. And I mean, I can even, in a very limited way, speak to this somewhat directly. When I was able to purchase a home, first home a couple of years ago, and through that whole process, I had realtors talking about things like, oh, maybe you should consider North Minneapolis now. North Minneapolis is turning. That was the quote, right? Which is code for saying North Minneapolis is whitening, so maybe it's a good idea now, And when I've talked to black folks who bought a home, same kind of thing, but the inverse. It's like, oh, you might feel more comfortable, if you're north of this particular street, or this might be a better fit if you live in that particular area. Like that sort of sorting is, still very, very much a thing. So in terms of, how do we move past that? There's some narrative work that just has to be done. And I'm hopeful that the stuff that Dan's doing, the stuff that we're doing can help that, can kind of illuminate how these racist processes sort of continually reproduce themselves through time. And if we don't kind of blow up some of these underlying assumptions, it seems like really difficult work, Like if white people in Minneapolis don't think structural racism is a thing, like how are you going to do something about structural racism? There's like this underlying political will building component. So
yeah, but and I think it's more about having access. I mean, you were talking about maybe if more of the African American communities would come forward because they can better articulate what their issues are. They don't have access to come forward. I mean, you can't just call up the news and want to say something positive, or you just can't go to the University of Minnesota and say, I want to work on it just because you don't have the access. So I think those people who have the access need to come and work with the communities to help them get the access so they can say what they need to say.
Yeah, and Dr. Scott, you mentioned Marvel Jackson, and I was taken with this idea of this African-American family, kind of working that idea of the American dream, but really building it educated, and then leaving, and us losing that as a city, and them losing what they were trying to build in Prospect Park. And I think that's powerful. That's the absent narrative, in a way, the almost speculative story that, Kevin, we've had people comment on, and you kind of talk about that in the film, of this what if of Black wealth and more, Black culture, Black leadership in this Minneapolis that could have been, if not for the racial covenants and the red lines. In fact, Kevin, you all came across an interesting one about a place many of us are familiar with as kind of an icon of wealth in the Twin Cities, and it's kind of the 50th and France area. Can you share a little bit of that? Because that, again, is one of those kind of mind blowers of what could have been.
Yeah, and this was, I wish Penny was here. She's the one who did the real labor of kind of unearthing that entire story. But yeah, the intersection of 50th and France was a Black-owned farm. The family, had that land, several acres, at least, and they kind of lost it in the Great Depression. And, you know, that land is probably the most, or one of the most expensive parcels, right, in the city of Minneapolis today. And you kind of see that process playing out in, like, that's not a unique story. Some additional work that we've done, Maggie Mills, one of the other Map and Prejudice members, documented along with Penny Peterson. It was like almost 24 Black families that lived in Southwest Minneapolis and Linden Hills before Linden Hills was a thing, right? You know, they're there in the 19-teens, 1920s, and they're slowly pushed out, where by mid-century there is no census tract down there containing multiple Black families. Some of that was through violence, some through intimidation, some through, you know, kind of crook, like, you know, contract for deed. You know, Anthony mentioned that. You know, that was like a tactic that was often used to effectively, you know, take property from Black folks, right? But like that, none of that had to happen. You know, to what Dan was saying, like, that could have gone in a very, very, very different direction if it wasn't for this intentional system of white supremacy that's encoded, you know, in large part as a result of racial covenants. And I do think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, in that, like, there's nothing about white supremacy that says it has to move forward unchecked through time, or we're always destined to have these racial disparities, or racial segregation in urban areas has always been a thing. Like, no, these are very deliberately constructed, and like anything deliberately constructed can be deconstructed. Like, they can be, you know, they can be disrupted, and, you know, that kind of gives me some hope, right? Like, you know, if we built this, we can take it apart. You know, there's certainly the capacity is there. It's part of it's, but a lot of it comes down to a question of political will and resources, material resources, and how those are or not going to be allocated moving forward.
I think, Dr. Scott, I mean, to your point, I think it is it's not just a Black, it's a city issue that we need more information about this. I mean, this is kind of what, hopefully this conversation is spreading the word as much as we can do that to get this out there. This existed. I mean, when growing up in South Minneapolis during the 60s, especially early 60s, you know, we had neighbors, we had businesses. It was, you know, down the street. I mean, we grew up 5 blocks away from each other. We had, you know, Gregory Hines, and we had Bobby Lyle. Everybody, we grew up within blocks of each other. There was a real positive attitude. I also lived in St. Paul with my grandmother in Rondo. What happened next is the other thing was the freeway system, which ultimately destroyed a lot of what was started to be built up in predominantly Black neighborhoods, which is when you were talking, Anthony, we didn't see these problems because we basically were all together in creating this community that we had to create, but then that was destroyed. And it took away a lot of the economics that ultimately, and the vibrancies and the Black businesses were gone, and broke us away, and ultimately made really physical barriers that have prevented you from, you know, crossing over the freeway to get to a neighborhood that was maybe predominantly white. I know, Dan, you talked about this a little bit in your film, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about it because I saw it happen in St. Paul with the Rondo neighborhood. You know, I mean, that was our Harlem, you know, neighborhood that was basically literally destroyed without any thought for where the people were going to go from that point in time. And obviously the freeway 35W cut off the Black neighborhood from any growth going to the west side. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know, it was important for me in terms of the kind of the story of African Americans in Minnesota and the Twin Cities, to at least introduce the idea of 35W in South Minneapolis. Because you're right, I feel like the good news is our friends on the other side of the river in St. Paul have done such a good job of bringing forward the story of Rondo, and Mr. Marvin Anderson and others have really for decades gone from, you know, the kind of pathology of just the loss to kind of really recreating the vibrancy of that community. But there's a lot less knowledge of what you're describing, Craig, the South Central historic Black community, the old South Side, and really what was kind of a focal point of Black literati and music, as you described, and, you know, kind of journalists and authors. Gordon Parks lived for a time on 4th Avenue. So it was important for me to at least introduce that idea that 35W had a devastating impact that, you know, can be connected to the erosion of the community, which means folks, including Black folks, are leaving, which means Central High isn't viable apparently because of numbers. And so you lose your high school after losing your middle school and your grade school in Bryant and Warrington. What kind of community do you have then? And despite all that you and Anthony described of the strong community, that freeway was one of those major moments that really eroded some of the fabric. And so just wanted to introduce it in this film. There is, some of Kevin's colleagues are doing work now on 35W and that story and that process. So that hopefully, like Rondo in '94, we'll have a better sense of the devastating impact of that through oral history, and again, through this idea of narratives and the past. But then to the point of this conversation, what do we do next? I mean, I think there is something powerful, obviously, about that George Floyd was murdered at 38th in Chicago, and then at 38th and 4th was this amazing Bronzeville in South Minneapolis, just blocks away. And so, to me, that speaks again to this idea of the struggles, but also the progress, and that we need to kind of be aware of both.
Yeah. Anthony, I wanted to talk a little bit about, because again, you were the same age and you grew up at the same time, basically, that I did. And it was something, and I just want to get your feeling about what it was like before the freeway and after the freeway. I know for me, it was very dramatic,
It was.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it was. Before the freeway, I'm almost old enough. I don't really remember streetcars that much. I mean, but I remember that the streets were still paved as a kid. The rails and everything was still there.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of doing some of the research I've done, I did a book. My wife's uncle, John Glatton, took pictures in the 40s and 50s. And somehow they ended up in my garage. And so they sat there for years and years. And my wife said, "Oh, you're a pack rat. What are you going to do?" And I told the Historical Society and the library about it. And it's turned into a book. And it was just, what was so striking about doing that is we had events around the country, around the community. In St. Paul, Hosmer Library, we went over to St. Peter Claver, to identify people in these pictures. And there was one lady that I got to know really well. Matter of fact, she even made brownies for us when we came to her church to see the pictures. But she lived on 37th and 4th Avenue. But she took the streetcar down 4th Avenue to Lake Street to go to the dentist in St. Paul, because that's where the black dentist was, in St. Paul. And she ended up marrying the dentist's son. And now she's a St. Paul person. But in the course of that, when I went to Mankato, I met so many St. Paul. I mean, Corky Finney was there. Lou Bellamy had just graduated. I mean, their whole St. Paul neighborhood was, and it just really made me realize how close the Twin Cities really are as far as those communities. So many people I know, well, they're married to a guy, well, he grew up in St. Paul. We're married to a girl, she grew up in Minneapolis. And before the freeway, somehow it just seemed like the cities were even closer. Even though that there wasn't a freeway, they could just go on that Lake Street bus and that'd take you all the way into St. Paul. It's just, and then growing up, when we first moved to 46th and 3rd Avenue, to the freeway, I could walk across 47th Street to go to school. There was the streets were there. Matter of fact, I walked right past my wife's house. She was in the 4th grade, and I was in the 8th grade. And she's walking down to Field, where she's in the 4th grade with my brother, Walter. They grew up all the way through school. But it just parted off the neighborhood so much. And even though then, growing up, I didn't know people that lived on the west side of Nicollet. I didn't.
No, yeah, you didn't even know. I mean, they're mythological creatures, exactly. I mean, living in the Rondo neighborhood, with my grandmother, she lived right a block off of University Avenue. I never, until I was 35 years old, did I ever cross University Avenue going north.
Yeah, so there was those inherent barriers, and the freeway really just kind of cemented those. Mm-hmm. And once they took out a lot of South Minneapolis, because you could go downtown you could take 4th Avenue all the way downtown, straight shot all the way downtown on 4th Avenue, and black people lived all the way down towards downtown. Because we lived 1900 15th Avenue for a while, always across the street from a school. Everywhere we lived was across from Phillips, we're across from Adams. across from Field. And the freeway really, the dividing, but it almost seems to go along with, as Dan was saying, you know, you close Warrington, you close Bryant, you close Central. And so you have this whole group, this whole neighborhood where you have no access to education, which is a big deal. Because I used to, my first job, St. Paul, I would get off early to go to the Central High School game on Friday. That Central game, everybody's going to be there. The whole neighborhood. It's in that school itself with Joyce Jackson. You had people there that lived in the neighborhood. That was the janitor there. I know him really well. I can't call his name now, but he was just like a teacher. Rudy Lee. The people in the neighborhood worked for the schools, and it was a big support for everybody. And so it seems like all these things kind of dovetail with each other to make a kind of a massive assault.
Yeah, one of the things that you brought up was the effects of housing as it relates to schools, because the systematic closing of schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods is there. Jobs. There is food deserts, which is something that's now you're starting to see more and more of. I wanted to talk about that and get people's opinion about that, because it is one thing to have the house, the equity aspects of the house, but there's another thing, which is the education, health, employment, food. That's the other side of this, that we who grew up in this neighborhood understood and realized. Who wants to take that?
Well, I think with the food desert, I think that's a real problem, because people who are living like between 25th or 35th and 50th, there's really no grocery store anymore. There's not like a Red Owl, Cub, or whatever. And so people have to go to Cub way down on 60th, or else they have the Stewart Co-op, which is really expensive. It's not like a grocery store. And so most people that are going there are not people from the neighborhood. They're people from outside of the neighborhood. So I think that's a major issue for the city council, for the governor, because why do Eden Prairie and all of the other areas have Hy-Vee and shopping strips all along the way, but right in this area, there's nothing? I mean, you're lucky if you have a dollar store. So I think that's a real problem of racial inequity.
Yeah, and it rolls through that, and there are more schools are coming back now because we've got some charter schools. But again, the fact that they closed down all the schools in South Minneapolis except for Field, which was an elementary school, it's a crime. One of the things I want to talk about too here is after the freeway system was they started the suburban venture. I don't know if Dan, if you and Kevin did anything about the suburban, the white flight process that happened, which is the next system that happened in this country that actually affected housing and African American communities. And obviously, if people believed that it was to save their soul, they had to go.
Yeah, Craig, we just introduced the idea, but Kevin can tell us that that's really where an important part of the story is in terms of the covenants, and that the actual map that you see in terms of barriers to wealth, literally and figuratively.
Yeah, no, we found far more racial covenants in the suburbs than we ever found in Minneapolis, both in aggregate total as well as like percentage of property that was racially restricted. And in kind of the Twin Cities in general, certainly in Hennepin County, the driving force behind racial covenants weren't individual homeowners. It wasn't a white person bought a house that was already built and then added a covenant. It tended to be a real estate developer would buy a large swath of land, it was Joe Blow's farm or whatever, divide it up into hundreds of municipal city lots, and then attach a racial covenant to each one and use that as a selling tool. We found multiple newspaper advertisements where these developers are printing the language of the covenants like right in the newspaper ad, right? They're using this as a promotional tactic and play on the fears of white people, at the time. So because of kind of the developmental history of the Twin Cities area, a lot of Minneapolis had already been developed around 1910. That's when the first racial covenant is found that we've been able to identify. The part of the city that wasn't developed, kind of the periphery, so like South Minneapolis, parts of Northeast, and parts of North, like up by the Victory neighborhood, that's where you see the racial covenants, because that's where land was being actively developed. The suburbs, on the other hand, are almost entirely undeveloped, circa 1910. So you have entire swaths of, especially the first-ring suburbs like St. Louis Park, Edina, Bloomington, Robbinsdale. I mean, these things are just blanketed in these racial restrictions because that's where a lot of the development was happening. And this served a very powerful kind of preventative function, which is, I think, an important part of the Minneapolis story. In Minneapolis, 1910, the black population, it's 0.92% of the city total. So it's a little bit under 1%. By 1950, it's, I think, 1.4%. So it stays pretty constant in the first half of the 20th century. It hovers around 1%. The Great Migration doesn't really hit Minneapolis till like the 60s and the 70s. We're kind of like the second stop. Folks would go to Detroit or Milwaukee first and then come to Minneapolis. So this era when all of these racial restrictions are being put into place is also the era where there's just a very, very small black population in the region. It's like around 1%, right? So by putting all those restrictions in there first, you're ensuring that, if and when more, African Americans move to Minneapolis, it's too late. You never even got a chance to get a foothold in one of those suburbs. This stuff has been racially restricted. It's been kind of coded as white from the very, very beginning. And that's a large part of why you see these concentrated neighborhoods like the Old South Side, which is, I think Dan mentioned earlier, both like a powerful story of resistance, but also just a powerful story of necessity, right? Like that location wasn't necessarily because, all the small number of black folks that we had at the time all decided they really wanted to be down by 38th, right? I mean, that was because like that was the part that, didn't have these restrictions where you could, buy a home where, a white mob wouldn't show up and try to shoot you, right? But that kind of that forcible constriction, which in turn allows for subsequent discriminatory mechanisms like the location of freeways, for example, that's made possible by this kind of ground level racial ordering that racial covenants are doing. And I think it's important to point out as well, freeways can't be used as kind of these discriminatory tactics unless you already have highly concentrated populations, right? Like you can't run a freeway disproportionately through like, over black folks' home, unless you have a bunch of black people like in one cluster, so you can put a freeway through it, right? And that wasn't kind of how the city was developing early on in the 20th century. It was because of all these racial covenants, because this kind of cordon of restrictions that allowed these kind of concentrations to happen, which in turn were subsequently kind of disinvested in. These are places where, there's not a lot of green space, places where there are food deserts, places where, you locate heavy industry. And all of those things are building off of this foundation that racial covenants made. And, the suburbs as well, right? Like this isn't, we think of city boundaries as being these hard boundaries, but in terms of like how people interact with space, like you can live in the suburb and work in the city or vice versa. I mean, these are fluid containers, and racial covenants emphatically were kind of coding these suburbs as white to allow for this huge exodus, the white flight exodus of the second half of the 20th century.
So what's happening, one of the things that's happening right now, or it's happened in a lot of cities, Paris here, New York, I mean, they're moving the projects or the housing situations, the affordable housing into the suburbs, and people are moving into the cities. So they're moving into the suburbs where there's not the support, there's not the businesses, not the availability for them to even get into social services. That's part of it. Is that what you're considering part of the design now? The design is now moving people from the suburbs that grew up in the suburbs into the city and moving the people who need the social structure of a city out into the suburbs.
Yeah, I think gentrification speaks to the fact that what is coded as desirable in terms of like space changes. It's not like what was great in the 1900s was the same thing that was great in 1800, the same thing that's great in like 2010 or whatever. Like, what is considered desirable changes. And a big part of, the strength of white supremacy is that the ability to navigate that is comparatively easier, right? Like in the 50s, suburbs are the hot new thing. If you're white, like you can go out there, you can sell your house and buy a new house in the suburb, right? And you'll actually get a very good, probably eligible for GI Bill or, good FHA rates or whatever. If you're black, you can't do that. Well, because those properties are the ones that have been skyrocketing in value, while properties in historically black neighborhoods are grossly underperforming city median, when the train changes again, kind of like it is now with gentrification, well, who can kind of take advantage of that, so to speak? Like the people who have money. And the people who have money are disproportionately the white people who have been able to benefit from this past century worth of favorable housing conditions that they've been able to kind of capitalize on. So it definitely changes where is desirable at any given moment, is constantly in flux. But there have been this interlocking set of systems kind of throughout history, or not throughout history, but certainly over the last century in Minneapolis that have allowed white people to navigate that with more freedom and more resources than the black community's been able to.
Right, and then it seems to be that white people are trying to move more back into this specific neighborhood. I see it, becoming more white, and I'm getting a lot of literature in the mail from people talking about, I want to buy your house, which I think is a racial insult, and I called that number and let them know that as well.
It does seem like that. It does seem.
Oh no, it's true. My mother lives on 40th and 3rd, 41st and 3rd, and so you get them all the time.
So somebody needs to do a study on that.
They seem to be moving people out of the South Minneapolis area, all the places like Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, even as far away as St. Cloud. In some of the suburban areas, they seem to be moving people out of I've noticed in the housing prices now are really kind of prohibitive for a lot of people. I mean, I see listings, I see things, 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, $450,000. I mean, that's a lot of money. And so I see this, I guess it's a gentrification type of a thing that I'm witnessing right here in my own neighborhood, South Minneapolis.
One last thing I wanted to talk about is just quickly, we know that this is there's an economics, there's a value to having a house, there's a value that has been separated from the black population as a whole. Some of us have been lucky enough to survive that, you're the Scott family, my family, but that we know was rare. I want to know, Brian, I want to just address you because Kevin had made a reference in the film that this city has one of the worst, black to white housing ratios in the country. What can we do to help to change that?
Yeah.
Well, I touched on, I think having as explicit about race in solutions as we have been in creating the disparities. And it's been striking to me in my time in working on housing with the foundation to see where federal policies and even state policies don't allow being explicit by race because it's seen as quote unquote reverse racism, which we have to get past as it relates to being able to place priority on addressing some of those racial disparities. So fair housing, as an example, really is more about fairness. It's not about equity. We have a project that we had supported that was specific to Native American youth. And that project, because of its HUD funding, initially was not able to provide priority for Native American youth who disproportionately experience homelessness. That's a federal policy issue. We should be able to prioritize resources for communities who have been on the wrong side of previous federal policies. So that's, I think, looking at how to adjust things so that there is opportunity to prioritize resources to communities who've been disproportionately impacted by past policy is a need, because that's where real dollars flow. And I think also on kind of the larger funding environment is just, it's very inside baseball. And I think that is perpetuates white supremacy. I think better transparency and understanding of how resources are managed and where the power brokers are, I think can help provide some way to expand opportunity or be involved in some of the decision making. I think there's a number of different tables that need to be more inclusive, including philanthropic tables.
we clearly are not going to solve the problem tonight here, and even though we all would like to, I think, but I want to thank you all for doing this. Anthony, Dr. Scott, Brian, Kevin, Daniel, for doing this. We know the issues are, we're going to have more media representation on a more balanced level, has to be delivered to the population. We have to address, this is an example of white privilege. When people say this is a perfect example of it, so you can point to this. I think this needs to change. It is about economics, it's about value, and it's one of the things that is going to sort of plague us for a little bit, but hopefully we can all pull together and make a difference here. Again, thank you for doing this, you guys, and thank the audience for being part of this conversation. I want to thank Penny and Bill George Foundation. I want to thank Kelly and Mike Palmer and Knock for making this possible. I want to thank again anybody who is interested in seeing this again. I want to recommend it. Go to mspfilm.org, our website. This is being recorded, so it'll be there. We didn't have a lot of questions, but I tried to ask as many of the questions as we possibly could for this. If you want, your questions may still be up on our Facebook account. So again, thank you. Have a good night, and vote like your life depends upon it. Coming up. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Kevin.